Welcome back to Bad Apple of the Bunch. As I said last time, it's a new series here on the Whoniversals where I analyse the odd dud story by writers who are otherwise beloved or critically acclaimed. And also, as I said last time, this isn't intended to shame those writers for abnormally missing the mark on occasion and thus proving they're not perfect or something like that. It's just an interesting case study of what went wrong for them on those rare instances. And today, I'm feeling brave enough to discuss a modern Who story. Let's dive in. So, Russell T Davies. He sure has had a wild rollercoaster of a reputation in Doctor Who fandom over the decades, huh? Going from,
wow, so this is the talented man who's going to resurrect Doctor Who from the ashes and properly adapt it and bring it forward into the 21st century. What a hero!
to,
Oh my god, what an over-romantic, tropey, saccharine hack of a writer who's far too in love with his own companions and legacy to deliver good sci-fi narratives. God, I can't wait until Moffat takes over.
to,
Ugh, finally, someone who knows how to write some good goddamn Doctor Who. I'm so glad he's coming back to save us from this whirlwind of toxic discourse, where we spend all day arguing over the Doctor's awkward response to Graham's cancer fears.
Unlike my video on David Whittaker, I'm not going to start off by going through every single other script that Russell has ever done for the show for comparison, because A, there's so goddamn many, and B, even more are a-comin', but I will say that he has given birth to a plethora of stories over the years that have received a myriad of different reactions, ranging from generally liked fun outings like Partners in Crime, Tooth and Claw, and The End of the World, to pretty controversial love 'em or hate 'em installments like Love and Monsters, The End of Time, and The Last of the Time Lords, to those weird middling episodes that no one ever seems to talk about like Planet of the Dead, The Next Doctor, and The Runaway Bride, to his utterly iconic action-packed cinematic finales like Doomsday, The Parting of the Ways, and Journey's End, to his almost universally acclaimed gems that live on as some of the show's all-time greats, like Midnight, Turn Left, and The Waters of Mars. He's a man with an admirably diverse repertoire, so it's only really natural that he'd have one, maybe two episodes that pretty much everyone universally gangs up on. So without further ado, New Earth. Right off the bat, New Earth finds itself in an awkward but kind of unique position. You see, the previous episode, The Christmas Invasion, may be the de facto first story of the 10th Doctor's tenure, but it also happens to barely feature him as an active presence until around the last third of the runtime. Now, I am not saying that this is a flaw. Russell was interested in the premise of how a companion would handle an Earth invasion scenario when the Doctor is out of commission, and of course it was the first regeneration of the revival, and Russell wanted to take great care to ease skeptical modern viewers into accepting the concept and view it through the eyes of the emotionally conflicted audience surrogate. And of course, when the 10th Doctor does finally take the stage, he utterly knocks it out of the park. But there is still this lingering pressure on future episodes to pick up the slack and showcase this newborn Doctor more freely and prominently, as well as how he and Rose interact in a more standard conflict that isn't impaired by the confusion of a regenerative crisis. Therefore, as the 10th Doctor's first full episode, as well as the opening episode of Series 2, a lot was riding on New Earth's shoulders. And this fact was clearly on the forefront of Russell's mind, as he brings back an antagonist of his previous Doctor's era to face off against this new one. Not a bad idea. Getting the newborn Doctor to win over uncertain audiences by pitting them against an established villain is a tried and tested selling technique dating back to the very first regeneration story. And you know what? Russell himself is undeniably a master of effectively establishing compelling characters right off the bat, or at the very least within their first couple of episodes. One only needs to rewind a season earlier or fast forward to a season later for good examples. So something like this should be as easy as pie for him. Did he succeed? Well, let's start with the setting, the titular New Earth itself, which I am kind of mixed to positive on. Now, a common criticism of Series 2 is that after the heavily domestic and Earthbound Series 1, the fact it insists on still hanging around Earth or Earth-like environments for most of its episodes feels like the show is unnecessarily limiting its own scope. And I confess, as someone who does love when Doctor Who goes full-out spacefaring, I do somewhat sympathise with that point of view. When the Doctor opens the episode by affirming that they're going
further than we've ever gone before
stepping out onto what is quite literally Earth 2.0, I do confess to feeling a tad miffed. But then again, I do get it on a thematic level. New Earth, the second story of the 10th Doctor's era, is a sequel to The End of the World, the second story of the 9th Doctor's era. And there is something kind of poetic about Rose's first date with the 10th Doctor paying homage to her first date with the 9th, right down to the metaphorical rebirth of the planet they had previously watched be destroyed. And it kind of parallels the Doctor's journey in the revival up to that point. When watching the Earth be destroyed, the Doctor was dwelling so much on what he had lost and morbidly focused on the finality of death. But now, after having healed some more from the trauma a season later, he's watching Earth's planetary successor thrive with newfound optimism and hope. I see what Russell was going for here, and it do be thematically deep. This homage to the first date even extends to the fact that they're facing off against the same villain, although we'll go more in depth on her later. Point is, despite how Windows XP backgroundish this setting may feel at first glance, it is internally justified when you think of the character journeys up to that point. So, the Doctor pays a visit to the hospital of New York, which prides itself on having cures to otherwise terminal diseases. He was summoned there by the face of Bo, a fellow guest who watched the destruction of the Earth in The End of the World. Bo serves as the inciting incident of the adventure, but nothing really more. He initially intended to impart his dying secret to the Doctor, but by the end he decides against it and prolongs it for another season because Russell loves himself a good prophecy story arc. See you in Gridlock, Bo. Other characters in the story include other patients in the hospital, like His Majesty the Duke of Manhattan, and the shady Sisters of Plenitude, who are all pretty serviceable. The more sympathetic the ends justify the means pleading of Novice Haim, contrasting the colder just doing my job firmness of Matron Casp and some of the others, really help to make this futuristic hospital filled with cat nuns feel grounded and familiar, as well as selling them as multifaceted medicinal professionals with a desire to help the sick. They really do have a sympathetic but professional edge that helps to cushion the fall when the Doctor discovers their horrifying inhumane secret later on. So the supporting character work is fine. Is it Russell's best showing? God no, far from it. Dude's so skilled at characterization that his best work makes stuff like this look mediocre. But, you know, in its own bubble, it's perfectly fine. No, where this story goes wrong stems with the returning villain of the piece, Lady Cassandra, last seen in The End of the World, featuring Gollum. As I said before, bringing back a pre-established villain to affirm a new incarnation's legitimacy is a good tool in a Doctor Who writer's kit, and the aforementioned parallel between Rose's first date with both 9 and 10 is a neat element. Cassandra being here in itself isn't a bad thing. Although that said, I do find her apparent demise in her prior story to be more compelling than her actual demise in this one. I think Cassandra works better as an unapologetic cautionary tale of where vanity and total self-interest can take someone, rather than the last-minute quasi-redemption and acceptance of death she gets here. But that's just me, and your mileage may vary. As I said, continuing her story isn't inherently a bad idea, and her involvement in the plot is to help expose the aforementioned horrifying secret that the Sisters of Plenitude are keeping under wraps. How have they managed to find the cure for all of these lethal illnesses, and at what cost? So looking for an opportunity to investigate personally, and recognizing Rose from their previous meeting, Cassandra lures her into her hiding place and uses some convenient sci-fi gizmo to possess Rose's body so she can go walkies. And we get extremely flamboyant and hypersexual shenanigans of Cassandra-possessed Rose feeling herself up, and trying and failing to act natural around the Doctor when they reunite. So, we're going for a comedic body swap story then. I mean, alright, I personally find this stuff kind of cringy, but let's not judge too soon. Let's see where Russell goes with this. So the Doctor and Rose are suspicious of the miracle medical work the feline pharmacists do, and so they go snooping about, stumbling upon some severe human rights violations. In order to perfect their miracle medicines, the sisters have grown their own human clone specimens and infected them with every disease in the galaxy to run tests on them, keeping them in dingy, cramped pods, and topping them up with a gruesome cocktail of disease every 10 minutes, thus providing a horrifying moral dilemma of whether the ends justify the means. If the ultimate cure to some of the worst contagions is worth it, if it's built on the intentional suffering and murder of countless people, and if livestock for medicinal purposes is ethical. It's an incredibly dark and super morbid idea for Doctor Who to do, and it's an incredibly bone-chilling situation to consider the implications of. What the hell is this doing in a comedic body swap story? Like, wasn't Cassandra possessed Rose literally making out with the Doctor not 2 minutes ago? Hello? Russell? And it doesn't stop there, because New Earth is home to some of the most baffling tonal whiplashing to grace a Doctor Who story. This deliciously bleak idea is constantly interrupted by jarring as hell campy moments, and it only becomes more egregious when the diseased humans break out and go on a hospital-wide rampage. 1 minute we'll be watching the human lab rats rampaging around the hospital and infecting anyone they come in contact with, and the next minute we'll be watching Cassandra jumping from Rose's body into the Doctor's and getting a glimpse of David Tennant's fabulous acting. And then there'll be a tense ladder climbing scene of the Doctor and Rose trying to escape the coughs and sneezels, with Cassandra hopping between the two of them and aggressively sassing and limp-wristing in the face of death. I mean, granted, I wish I had that kind of energy, but the point still stands. The tone of this episode is a complete mess, and these body swap comedy antics do not gel with this sincere ethical exploration of medical cattle whatsoever. Now, that is not saying that the tone has to stick rigidly to one mood throughout any given piece of media, but these are two very different extremes that don't sit well side by side at all, in some cases sharing the same scene. Also, this isn't an objective flaw by any means, but damn, the comedy is distressingly heterosexual in this episode. Like Russell, I know the straights are bizarre creatures whose interactions are unfathomable to us homos, but even I know this isn't how they tick. Anyway, speaking of the straights, how do our regulars fare in this outing? Well, as mentioned earlier, this is David Tennant's first full episode as the Doctor, without any of the complications that come with a regeneration crisis. As such, it's very early days for Ten, and they're trying to get a feel for what his personality is going to be like. He does some suspicion, he does some investigating, he does some moral outrage. It's fairly standard stuff, and doesn't really leave as strong of an impression as, say, 9 did in merely his first episode. That said, the solution to the conflict and how it informs his character is ridiculously heavy-handed. Get it? He is the Doctor, because he literally cured all the patients. Like, it ain't really the satisfying moment of him finally coming into his own that the narrative seems to think it is, especially since the solution itself is pretty nonsensical and overly convenient on both a plotting and emotional level. It's like a poor man's version of the plot resolution of The Doctor Dances. Though speaking of which, it must be mentioned that Russell was apparently compelled to take this direction by the comments of a certain Vestin to ma vie, who had poked fun at him for constantly killing off his characters. Ugh, see what happens when that fiend gets inside the heads of otherwise great writers? Mediocrity ensues. As for Rose, she's kind of a non-entity for the most part, since Cassandra is possessing her body for the majority of the runtime. Apparently this was done because Russell promised Billie Piper an episode where she could demonstrate her comedic chops after having her channel so much emotion in Series 1. That said though, I feel like this creative direction kind of hampers the Doctor-Rose relationship at a point where seeing how they act together is crucial to understanding where they are with each other. At any other time after this, a comedic body swap narrative involving our regulars would be fine. But this is their first proper outing since the complications of the regeneration, and I think showcasing how they work together in a more conventional crisis after such a drastic status quo shift would have been more effective in helping the newborn 10th Doctor to settle in. Cassandra's body swapping shenanigans where she possesses either one of the two for pretty much the entire duration of the conflict kind of gets in the way of that. Apparently this episode was in competition with Tooth and Claw to be the first episode of Series 2, and honestly I think the latter would have been a far better choice to kick off the season with in that regard. Not only do Ten and Rose act far more conventionally together in that one, and showcase their new bond more prominently, but their hubris kicking off the Torchwood arc, which in turn leads to the events of the finale, would have made for a much stronger and more compelling dramatic kick to lead the series with, and in turn would have helped the season feel more overall cohesive. Then again, that would invalidate the thematic first date with 10 paralleling the first date with 9 thing I mentioned earlier, and whether that's worth sacrificing in favour of what I proposed is up for debate. Anyways, shall we wrap this up? New Earth is kind of a shambles. It does have more thematic substance and overall merit than many would give it credit for, and there's a lot of potential in the human farm commentary, but the comedic subplot with Cassandra and how that affects the rest of the narrative elements right down to our leads does unfortunately drag the experience down, and makes for one of Russell's most messy contributions to Doctor Who. It's definitely the baddest apple of his bunch, I'm afraid to say. But then again, if this is the worst he gets, I'm not that fussed about it.